Good evening. I'm Liam, and this is Liam Analysis. Tonight, we're examining a critical moment in North American energy diplomacy, a moment that unfolded in 72 hours and exposed something fundamental about which country actually holds the leverage in this relationship. The White House issued what it intended to be a devastating threat. What it triggered instead was panic in American oil refineries. And the response from Canada was 6 words, spoken calmly, without theatrics, that revealed a structural reality Washington had apparently been ignoring for years. This is the story of those 3 days, and what they tell us about where the real power lies in North American trade. Tuesday morning, the White House issues a formal statement accusing Canada of weaponizing energy exports as a tool of economic coercion. The irony would be difficult to miss if anyone were paying attention to the irony instead of the threat itself. It was the United States that had imposed tariffs on Canadian goods. It was the United States now threatening to restrict Canadian imports. But here's what the statement actually said. The administration was actively reviewing emergency powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Such restrictions could be implemented within 72 hours of a formal determination. The move was being framed as a response to Canada's alleged refusal to negotiate in good faith. A refusal that, according to 3 members of the Canadian trade delegation who spoke to the Globe and Mail on background, consisted primarily of Canada declining to accept terms that would have required rolling back 19 months of trade diversification in exchange for partial tariff removal that had already been ruled inconsistent with trade agreements by the Bilateral Dispute Resolution Panel. Translation: Canada said no to a bad deal. So the White House threatened oil. The threat landed in the American energy sector like a live electrical wire dropped into standing water. Within 4 hours of the statement's publication, the market moved. The share prices of the 4 largest American refining companies declined sharply on panic-driven trading volume. Valero, down 3.1%. Marathon Petroleum, down 4.2%. Phillips, 66, down 5.7%. HF, Sinclair, down 3.8%. These aren't companies with speculative positions. These are companies whose investors understand their infrastructure intimately. And those investors had just been told the government was considering disrupting the feedstock supply that their refineries physically cannot replace on any timeline the market would consider manageable. Think about that. Not hours, years. To understand why American refinery operators were terrified, you need to understand something that most Americans, and apparently the architects of the threat, do not know. The United States imports more crude oil from Canada than from any other country on Earth. Not close. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, Canada supplies 52% of all American crude oil imports. That's more than OPEC nations combined, more than Mexico, more than Saudi Arabia, more than any combination of Gulf producers the White House could realistically assemble as an alternative. In absolute terms, 4.1 million barrels of crude oil per day flow from Canadian fields across the border into American refineries, primarily through the Keystone and Enbridge pipeline systems that connect Alberta's oil sands to processing facilities in Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Texas, and Louisiana. Now here's where it gets critical. The crude oil Canada exports is not interchangeable with crude oil from other sources. Canadian crude, specifically the heavy high-sulfur bitumen blend from Alberta's oil sands, is the feedstock that approximately 11 major American refineries have been specifically engineered to process. These are not general-purpose facilities. They were built, modified, and in several cases entirely rebuilt over decades of capital investment to run on Canadian heavy crude. Their distillation units, coking equipment, hydrocracking systems, all calibrated to the specific density, sulfur content, and viscosity profile of Alberta blend crude. Switching them to process a different type of crude requires physical retrofitting that takes between 18 months and 3 years, and capital expenditures that the American Petroleum Institute estimates at $400 million to $1.2 billion per facility. You cannot flip these refineries to Saudi-like crude or West Texas Intermediate or Brent blend the way you change a fuel grade at a gas station. You would have to rebuild them. And while you're rebuilding them, while they're offline, the United States loses refining capacity equivalent to approximately 19% of its total domestic output. Let me repeat that. The threat to restrict Canadian oil imports had been issued as though Canada were an optional supplier. Canada is not an optional supplier. Canada is for roughly one-fifth of American refining capacity, the only supplier that the existing infrastructure can physically accommodate without a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar reconstruction program. This is what the American energy sector suddenly understood, and this is what Canada had always known. Within 6 hours of the White House statement, the American Petroleum Institute convened an emergency call with its 23 largest member companies. According to two executives who were on that call, and described its substance separately to Financial Times, the consensus reached within the first 20 minutes was unambiguous. If the restriction were implemented, the consequences would be severe and immediate. Operational shutdowns at a minimum of 7 facilities within 30 days. Full supply chain disruption across the affected refinery network within 60 days. Gasoline price spikes in the Midwest, heating oil shortages in the Great Lakes region. Jet fuel supply disruptions for major hubs serving Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland. A senior executive at one of the affected refinery companies told a financial news service on Background, a quote that subsequently appeared in 4 separate news reports without attribution. "Whoever wrote that threat has never been inside one of our facilities. If they had, they would have understood that this is not leverage. This is a self-inflicted shutdown notice." On the morning of the 3rd day after the threat was issued, something unprecedented happened inside American refineries. The operations managers of 11 American oil refineries, stretching from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, sent urgent internal memos to their boards. Not press releases, not prepared statements, internal memos. The kind written when people running a facility believe something is going wrong faster than their contingency plans anticipated. The memos describe the same condition across every facility: feedstock shortages, schedule disruptions, and the activation of emergency procurement protocols that had been designed as theoretical safeguards and had never previously been triggered in a non-hurricane operating environment. No Canadian minister had made a speech. No Canadian tariff had been imposed. No supply had been cut. Canada had not even formally responded to the threat. The panic was not caused by what Canada had done. It was caused by what American refinery operators suddenly understood that Canada was, and by the realization arriving with the force of something that should have been obvious all along. The leverage in this relationship does not run the direction Washington assumed. Ottawa said nothing publicly for 72 hours. The silence was not confusion, it was discipline. Because Mark Carney had already decided what he was going to say, and he was waiting for the right moment to say it with maximum effect. The press conference was called for 10 a.m. on day 4. No advanced briefing, no distributed remarks, no background material circulated to reporters in the hours before. Carney walked to the podium alone in a room at the Lester B. Pearson Building in Ottawa, where the Department of Foreign Affairs holds its formal media engagements, with the composed deliberateness of a man who has already done the calculation and is simply presenting the result. He did not begin with the threat. He began with infrastructure. For 4 minutes, with the calm specificity of a central banker presenting a quarterly report, he walked through the physical architecture of North American energy supply, the 4.1 million barrels per day flowing from Canada, the Keystone System, the Enbridge Line 5, the refinery configurations in Illinois, Ohio, and Louisiana that had been engineered around Canadian heavy crude over 30 years of integrated capital investment. Every number he cited came from American sources: U.S. Energy Information Administration data, American Petroleum Institute refinery capacity assessments, Congressional Budget Office infrastructure conversion cost estimates. According to a senior Canadian communications official who spoke to the CBC afterward, this was deliberate. He wanted the answer to arrive with no factual surface that the White House could attack. If every number is American, you cannot dispute the numbers without disputing your own government's data. And if you cannot dispute the numbers, you cannot dispute the conclusion. Then he looked directly into the camera, not at his notes, not at the assembled journalists, into the camera, the lens carrying his image live to every newsroom and every trading floor monitoring the feed. And he said 6 words that the Financial Times would later call the most precisely aimed sentence in the history of North American energy diplomacy. "We know exactly what you need." He let them sit in the air for 3 full seconds. Then he continued, Canada has no intention of using its energy position as a weapon. That is not the Canadian way, and it is not consistent with the relationship both countries deserve. But he said, a government that threatens to restrict an import that its own refineries physically cannot replace without years of reconstruction and billions in capital expenditure is not exercising leverage. It is demonstrating a gap between its stated position and its operational reality. And Canada, he said, had simply decided it was no longer useful to pretend that gap did not exist. Then, in the closing sentence of his 9-minute response, we know exactly what you need. We have always known. And we are prepared to supply it as partners, on terms that reflect the reality of what this relationship actually is, not on terms that pretend the reality is something else. On the surface, those 6 words mean something straightforward. Canada possesses the specific energy resource that American refineries require, in the volume they require it, in the grade they are physically configured to process. No other country on Earth can say that in 2025. Canada can. But beneath that surface meaning, they mean something that lands harder. They mean, we have always held this position. We held it when you were threatening us. We held it while your refinery boards were filing emergency memos. We held it during 19 months of tariffs and ultimatums and briefing documents with invented statistics. We were never the supplicant in this relationship. We were simply the partner with the patience not to say so until the moment it could not be denied. The threat was designed to show Canada who held the power. Instead, it showed the world. Warren Buffett was asked by a financial journalist for his assessment of the episode. His answer has since been reproduced in whole or in part in more than 340 separate publications across 27 countries. He said the North American energy situation was the cleanest illustration he had seen in his investing lifetime of a principle he called infrastructure leverage. Infrastructure leverage is a form of economic power that is entirely different from market leverage or financial leverage and far more durable than either. Here's how Buffett explained it. Market leverage can be eroded by competition. Financial leverage can be neutralized by capital. Infrastructure leverage, the leverage that comes from being the only entity whose physical output is compatible with another entity's physical systems, cannot be eroded or neutralized on any timeline that matters in a crisis. It can only be resolved by the party that needs the infrastructure spending years and billions of dollars to build an alternative. Until that alternative is built, the party with the compatible infrastructure holds a form of power that no tariff, no threat, and no press statement can touch. Buffett then offered a striking metaphor. I watched the White House issue the oil threat with the same detached curiosity I felt when I watched a chess player threaten to take a piece that, on closer examination, turned out to be the piece supporting the rest of their structure. The threat sounded powerful from a distance. Up close, it was a threat to harm yourself in order to pressure someone else, which is the definition of a threat that will not be carried out, which therefore functions not as leverage, but as information. It tells the other side exactly how much you understand about the board you're playing on. Carney's 6 words, Buffett said, were the response of someone who had understood the board from the beginning. Not a counterattack, not a boast, a simple statement of structural fact that had the precision of a scalpel because it required no elaboration. We know exactly what you need contains everything. The acknowledgement that Canada is aware of American refineries' dependency, the implicit assurance that Canada is not planning to exploit it, and the unmistakable signal that the era of pretending the dependency does not exist is over. Buffett concluded with a principle that applies far beyond energy. The most dangerous position in any negotiation is not weakness, it is misunderstood strength. Canada had enormous structural leverage for years. Washington spent years assuming that leverage did not exist. The 3 days between the threat and the press conference were the moment the misunderstanding became impossible to sustain. And once a misunderstanding of that magnitude becomes impossible to sustain, the entire negotiating architecture built on top of it collapses simultaneously. That, he said, is what those 11 refinery memos actually were. Not panic. The sound of an architecture collapsing. The consequences arrived in waves, each reinforcing the last. The first wave was immediate and financial. Refining sector equities continued their decline through day 4 and day 5, as Carney's press conference confirmed what markets had been pricing since day 3. The bilateral energy relationship had entered a period of fundamental instability. The numbers: Valero, 8.3% decline over 5 trading days; Marathon Petroleum, 7.1% decline; Phillips, 66, 6.4% decline. Combined market capitalization destruction, $14.2 billion. J.P. Morgan Chase, in a research note distributed to institutional clients, described this figure as the market's invoice to Washington for the cost of threatening infrastructure it does not have a replacement plan for. Meanwhile, the Canadian energy sector moved in the opposite direction. Canadian Natural Resources, up 6.2%. Suncor Energy, up 5.8%. SOCO, up 7.1%. In 5 trading days, roughly $11 billion in market value migrated from American refining companies to Canadian energy producers, a bilateral wealth transfer driven entirely by the revelation of a structural dependency that had always existed but had never before been tested publicly. The second wave was domestic and political, and it came from exactly the direction the White House least wanted it. The governors of Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio, 4 states whose refinery infrastructure is among the most directly dependent on Canadian crude, jointly requested an emergency briefing from the Department of Energy within 48 hours of Carney's press conference. Their letter, leaked to the Associated Press and published in full, asked a single question the administration had no satisfying answer to. What is the federal government's operational plan for maintaining refinery feedstock supply in these states if the threatened restriction is implemented, and on what timeline can that plan be executed? The Department of Energy's response, delivered 4 days later, described strategic alternatives that independent analysts assessed as requiring between 2 and 4 years to implement at a cost of $18 billion to $34 billion. Think about what that means. A threat designed to force capitulation within days now faces reality. You cannot solve this problem in less than 2 years. 2 Republican senators from affected states publicly called the threat operationally reckless. A senator from Iowa asked on the Senate floor whether anyone in the administration had consulted with an actual refinery engineer before issuing the statement. The third wave was international and carried the longest structural consequences. 5 nations that had been in various stages of energy partnership discussions with the United States. Discussions premised on the assumption that American energy policy was stable and predictable, quietly requested timeline extensions on their frameworks. The diplomatic language was careful, but analysts in Brussels, Tokyo, and Canberra translated it without difficulty. These governments were waiting to see whether Washington understood the infrastructure it was threatening before committing to frameworks that might be disrupted by the same category of miscalculation. The International Energy Agency, in its monthly oil market report published 9 days after the original threat, included an unusual passage. Policy uncertainty in North American bilateral energy arrangements has become a material risk factor in global supply planning. This language had never previously appeared in an IEA monthly report in reference to the United States and Canada. The fourth wave was structural, and it was silent, and it was the most consequential of all. 3 Canadian energy companies, Canadian Natural Resources, Cenovus, and Imperial Oil, accelerated their discussions with European and Asian offtake partners in the 30 days following the episode. They secured forward purchase agreements that redirected a combined 340,000 barrels per day of future production capacity away from American buyers and toward overseas markets. This was not a policy decision by the Canadian government. It was a commercial decision by private companies who had watched a foreign government threaten their supply contracts and concluded entirely rationally that geographic diversification of their customer base was now a risk management necessity rather than an optional strategy. The redirection of 340,000 barrels per day does not destabilize American supply in the short term, but over 5 years it meaningfully tightens the margin of available Canadian crude for American refineries. And it does so in a way that cannot be reversed by a press statement, a treaty, or a change of administration. Infrastructure takes time to build. Markets, once redirected, take time to redirect again. The episode did not just reveal the dependency. It began quietly and commercially to reduce it on Canada's terms, on Canada's timeline, at Canada's pace. Here is where we stand. The White House issued a threat to restrict Canadian crude oil imports as a tool of trade leverage. Within 72 hours. 11. American refineries had activated emergency procurement protocols. $14.2 billion in market value had migrated from American refining companies to Canadian energy producers. Governors of 4 states demanded to know the federal government's operational alternative plan. 2 Republican senators called the threat operationally reckless. The International Energy Agency flagged it as a material risk factor in global supply planning. And Mark Carney walked to a podium and said 6 words sourced entirely in American infrastructure data, aimed with the precision of someone who had been holding the answer for a long time and had simply been waiting for the question. We know exactly what you need. The 4.1 million barrels per day still flow. The refineries are still running. No formal restriction was implemented, but something changed in those 3 days that cannot be changed back. The structural reality of the bilateral energy relationship is now a matter of public record. Canada's incomparable position as the specific, engineered, non-substitutable supplier for roughly 1/5 of American refining capacity is confirmed by the market reaction. Acknowledged by state governors, documented by the International Energy Agency. The era of that dependency existing quietly off the diplomatic table is over. The questions that define what comes next are being asked now in every energy boardroom from Houston to Calgary, in every foreign ministry that watched the episode, and in every American community from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, whose economic stability runs through those refinery stacks. First, can the United States design a trade posture toward Canada that accounts for the infrastructure reality that the threat exposed? Second, if so, what does that posture look like when the party with the leverage is the one being asked to negotiate? Third, or does Washington continue on the current path, watching Canadian energy companies quietly redirect future production capacity toward markets that have never threatened to cut them off? Either path has a cost. Only one of them has a floor. We know exactly what you need. 6 words that required. 19 months of infrastructure investment, 3 days of refinery panic, $14.2 billion in migrated market value, to become the only sentence in the room that no one could dispute. The threat was designed to show Canada who held the power. Instead, it showed the world. The real power in North American energy is not in the White House. It is in the specificity of infrastructure, the compatibility of systems, the reality that you cannot replicate in months or years what was built over decades. It is in Canada's refineries being the only answer to America's refineries' needs, and in Canada's patience to wait until that answer could no longer be denied. The geopolitical implications of this moment will unfold across months and years. The energy markets will continue to react. The trade negotiations will continue, now on a fundamentally different foundation. At Liam Analysis, we track these structural shifts as they develop, the moments that reshape institutions and power relationships. If you found this analysis valuable, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for daily updates on the economic and geopolitical decisions shaping our world. The bell icon ensures you don't miss when we break down the next critical moment. Thank you for watching. I'm Liam. This is Liam Analysis.